I'm Elizabeth Henry, president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts. And for those that don't know us, ELM is a 122-year-old environmental advocacy organization based right on Beacon Hill. We've been advocating for Massachusetts to lead the nation in responsible environmental policy since 1898. And we've long been a convener on environmental issues, so we're proud to continue this long tradition in this new digital way. I am really thrilled to welcome over 300 registrants joining us from across the Commonwealth here on Zoom. We're also streaming this on Facebook Live, and we'll post the recording on our YouTube page. This is the 10th and final edition of ELM's Wednesday webinar series. We began on April 8th, which feels like 1,000 years ago. It was just 2 weeks into the state shutdown. And we were seeking to explore this intersection of public policy and these two crises of COVID-19 and climate change. Together with you, these last 9 weeks, we've heard from leaders across the Commonwealth. And here's a little bit of what they said. They said that we must fight for racial justice and equity, not just for reducing greenhouse gases. That COVID-19 demonstrates what happens when science is ignored by policymakers. That the human impacts of climate change drive compelling and persuasive journalism. That youth climate activists are expanding the realm of what's possible for environmental policy. That Massachusetts must challenge the federal government to enforce our hard-fought environmental protections. That we must redesign our transportation system to be clean, accessible, and safe. That the political will for corporate advocacy on climate policy is not diminished because of the pandemic, but in many cases actually strengthened. And finally, that we must elect environmental champs at all levels of government if we want to see a future that is clean, green, and fair. I think it's really fitting to cap off this series with a forward look from our own Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Katie Theaharides. For the remainder of this hour, you can expect about 15 minutes of remarks from the Secretary, 20 minutes of discussion with questions from the ELM team and those that were submitted in advance from registrants like you, and then 20 minutes of live Q&A from the audience. So you can click below on that Q&A button to submit a question, or you can upvote the questions you like. We probably won't be able to cover every question, but we'll try to do as many as we can. As I mentioned, this event is being broadcast on Facebook Live, and the recording will be available to share on ELM's YouTube page. So with that, welcome, Madam Secretary. Secretary Theaharides oversees the Commonwealth's 6 environment, natural resource, and energy regulatory agencies. These include the Department of Environmental Protection, Departments of Public Utilities, Department of Energy Resources, Department of Conservation and Recreation, Department of Agricultural Resources, and the Department of Fish and Game. She also serves as chair of Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, the Energy Facilities Siting Board, and the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Personally, I've been pleased to watch her rapid rise through the ranks of the Baker administration over the last 4 years. In 2016, she started as the Director of Climate and Global Warming Solutions, ascended first to Assistant Secretary, then Secretary, then Undersecretary, and now Secretary. She holds a bachelor's from Dartmouth College and a master's of science from UMass Boston.
Thank you, Elizabeth. What a great roundup of discussions you've had, and it's terrific to be here today with so many people who share our mission to protect and conserve our natural resources while building stronger, more resilient communities across Massachusetts. A big thank you to ELM for putting together this webinar series during what has been such a difficult time for all of us, and for allowing this community to continue to connect together. So much of the energy we get in any effort, I think, comes from the chance to sit together around a table or to come together in a community or in a forest or a field, in this work at least, or to raise our voices around a common cause. And it's so important these dialogues continue, especially during a time of distancing and a time of great reckoning on the continued legacy of racism in our country. For all of us, I know that the tragic and senseless murders of George Floyd and too many other men and women of color, and the protest demanding justice and change has been a time when listening, conversation, and shared purposeful action is so important. At EEA, we're continuing the work led by our Diversity Inclusion Council to have the conversations we need to have with employees and stakeholders to ensure that everyone feels supported and respected, and to rightly place diverse voices front and center in the important work we're doing to protect the environment secure clean energy future and build more resilient communities. And to that end, our environmental justice director is working across the Secretariat and across the administration with stakeholders to increase access, involvement, and opportunities. I think during this nationwide conversation, we've been focused foremost on listening and learning and putting in place the actions we can take to both support our own employees and really to move forward together. But we know, and I think we know this across the environmental field, that in our country for too long, communities of color, non-English speakers, and other groups have been left out of environmental planning, out of the clean energy transformation, and all of the work we do to conserve land and species. And so I think of this moment as an opportunity, and I hope it's not a moment. I hope it continues to be a sustained effort, and that environmentalists are part of that, and that we can take more meaningful, concrete steps towards, I think, what has been a long-held goal in this movement. It's in that spirit, I think, that I look forward to working together in the days and the weeks ahead. And I did want to talk as well a little bit about this moment in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and what that has meant for our work. One of the things we've certainly seen, and I know all of you have seen, is the importance of continued efforts to protect and ensure access to open space. And the road that we've built here in Massachusetts and our legacy of land conservation and environmental stewardship has perhaps never served us more well than during this period of time when for many, many weeks, the access to the outdoors was one of the few places we could go safely, really, in a pandemic. And during this time, our state parks and beaches have become wildly popular. And so we've been working hard to ensure that people have access to these resources while continuing to prevent the spread of COVID-19. We've been looking a lot at some data that Google has been putting together based on people's cell phone locations. And throughout the spring, we saw this just tremendous uptick in users at state parks and beaches. And as of June 7th, which is they sort of roll in the numbers on a semi-weekly basis, in some counties in Massachusetts, we've seen numbers almost 200% above baseline for that day last year in terms of parks usage. And that story is true among our Northeast neighbors and even down the coast and in California. We're seeing record numbers of people come out for fresh air and exercise, for a respite from worry. And, you know, we hope these are users who will continue to use parks and open spaces and continue to value these places after the pandemic is over. But, you know, our primary mission here during this time has been to make sure people have access in a way that's safe in terms of the virus, in a way that's safe for first-time users who may be going out and doing something recreationally that they haven't in the past in terms of boating or hiking or fishing, hunting, as well as providing equitable access to people in different communities across the state, and then making sure that our environmental resources are protected while we have these high numbers of users. As we've been very focused on our own state resources, we've also worked to convene an outdoor recreation task force with stakeholders and municipal officials to continue to allow during the reopening process as much access to the outdoors as possible, with guidance to ensure that these activities will be done as safely as possible. And our work has addressed everything from youth sports to things like whitewater rafting, to basketball courts and playgrounds. We were very pleased to open a lot of these resources this week, including spray decks, which I know as a parent, I certainly feel like is an essential resource this summer. But you know, there's also been the services that we oversee and some of which we provide that have been essential services throughout the pandemic, whether it's our Department of Public Utilities, working with the utilities to make sure the services they're providing are resilient and are safe. That construction work that happens for those utilities is being done in a proper fashion and could continue to go forward. And then on the agricultural side of our shop, a really critical piece of this was food safety and security, and continues to be as we go forward. And the governor announced some exciting news relative to that last week. We opened up a $56 million funding, which includes a $36 million grant program that opened last week. That is an opportunity for local food producers, for farmers, for fishermen, and for aquaculturists to better adapt to the new sort of direct to market experience that we're seeing a real demand for. But in doing so, to better support the food insecurity issues we've been seeing throughout the pandemic in places like Chelsea. And so the grant will also include a lot of opportunity for summer meal sites, for food banks, for better transportation of local food to communities experiencing food insecurity, and for urban farming and getting kids in urban settings outside to grow food in their own communities. So it's something we're really excited about, but has been one of the opportunities that has come from the experience with the pandemic. I think something else that's been really clear to us, and you know, we've gotten a lot of questions over the last couple of months about the role that the pandemic plays in either preventing us from working on our environmental priorities or on climate change, or for slowing our work, or do we have concerns about what any kind of pending economic slowdown might mean for our work. And what I would say to that is that really there's never been a more important time for us to dig down and continue our efforts on climate change. I think the pandemic has given us a glimpse of sort of what happens when you don't prepare for something proactively. Certainly, I think arguably at the national level, that was the case here, and we don't want to be in that situation with climate change, waiting for, you know, sort of denying the science and waiting for something to happen rather than getting as prepared, as proactively as we can. And I think, you know, this decade really holds the greatest possibility to flatten our climate curve and reduce the impacts to human life and health that we're already experiencing. And we've also caught a glimpse of the way air quality can improve when we're not all out on the road in our vehicles. And we certainly don't want a pandemic to be the cause of that. But we do want to keep those blue skies and fresh air. And so I think that's been something else we've seen here, as well as finally the link between respiratory illness and air pollution, much of which is caused by those vehicles. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. But on the climate change end, and picking up on that theme, earlier this year, the governor set a new goal for the Commonwealth to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The target's consistent with where the science says we need to be. You know, basically we set our goal of 80% back in 2008 based on the latest science at the time. In 2018, that science was updated and said, to avoid the worst impacts from climate change, every nation around the world really had to be getting to a net zero target, to neutral emissions by the middle of the century. And so that's where we've set our target. And obviously it requires hard work and collaboration across the economy and all sectors. But this year we are working towards completion of a clean energy and climate plan for 2030, as well as our roadmap to 2050, outlining not just the path over the next 10 years, but making sure that that path over the next 10 years will get us ultimately to that net zero goal. A lot of things underline that, and there's been significant stakeholder involvement so far and will continue to be, but we're really looking at the ways we can achieve this in the most equitable and efficient manner, and in ways that achieve co-benefits in terms of resiliency, in terms of economic goals, and in terms of supporting communities throughout the state. One of the things we're doing is looking at different pathways to get there. These are scenarios, so we understand in detail the types of transformation that needs to occur and to figure out the different options we have in terms of policy decisions. I think that's important because we're committed to making this happen, but we're also committed to making it happen equitably for folks across the state, for urban and rural communities, with the need to continue to build our economy and to keep quality local jobs and thriving businesses in the state. We're also digging into the nearer term challenges at the same time, looking at the policies we need for the next 5 and 10 years to make sure that we're getting onto those pathways to get towards the 2050 goals. It's been really exciting and groundbreaking work, and I've been pleased to have our relatively still new Undersecretary David Ismay leading this effort with our climate team. I think that everyone on my team, included myself, is learning new things from this analysis, even for folks who have been experts in sort of climate modeling. We're seeing some valuable and surprising results. And so approaching this modeling effort with humility and looking forward to learning. I do want to stop and save time for questions, but one of the last things I'd mentioned is, I know many of you have been following our work on the transportation sector and know that in Massachusetts, as in many states across the country, 40% of our emissions come from the transportation sector. And of those, 84% are from the cars and trucks on the road. And so one of the reasons we have been laser focused on this is because we've made progress in the electricity sector. We have to keep making progress there. We've made some progress in the building sector, although that's another space we need to make even more. But the transportation sector is such a large chunk now and continues to go up. It's also become more clear during the pandemic that clean air and less pollution mean better public health and are critical for the well-being of our residents. And so the pandemic has really highlighted the connection between air pollution and respiratory disease. And so it's not just a climate change piece here, it's also about local air quality and about communities who have been disproportionately burdened by air pollution. And these communities are often communities of color. TCI is a way to ensure sustained investment in transportation that gives people better, more affordable choices for getting to work, to school, and to healthcare, while cutting pollution that makes people sick and makes them more vulnerable to disease. The COVID pandemic has also shown how much better policy works when states collaborate to ensure consistency across regions. And so this has been sort of something that we've long worked on, whether it's been through the Climate Alliance, through TCI, through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, through our partnership with New England states and the Eastern Canadian Premiers and others. We've made a lot of progress, whether it's on energy policy, climate policy, environmental action, when we've worked together as a region, particularly in this time of absence of federal leadership and rolling back of so many important environmental regulations. The power of states coming together and working on challenges like this has been really essential. And I think it's certainly been helpful too when we think about both dealing with the COVID pandemic and recovering from the pandemic. And so that's something we're thinking about as well, and I can talk more about in the question session, but certainly our eyes are on what economic stimulus packages continue to look at and how we ensure that those are part of a green recovery and not just more of the same. So I will stop there, but just say we look forward to continuing to work with this group all of our advocates and stakeholders to ensure that we can emerge from this pandemic stronger, more resilient, and with a greener, more inclusive future ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Secretary. We have just a massive list of questions that were submitted by viewers today, as well as from the ELM team. So I'm going to try to focus on some of these key priorities first. We're not going to get through all of them here, and I see they're flooding in online too. So we're in for a great discussion here for the next 40 minutes. I want to talk first about this net zero determination letter. For those listening in, the Commonwealth has updated our 2050 goal, as the Secretary mentioned, to be net zero, and which means in practice that the Commonwealth is committing to reduce its own emissions by at least 85% and offsetting or sequestering the remaining 15. You mentioned that you're midway through this year-long study to map out these pathways to achieve net zero, and you also said that there's surprising results. Can you share your top 2 or 3 takeaways from this process so far?
So, you know, I think when we began to dig into this, one of the worries was, is this even feasible in the time frame we have, with the technology we have, with the needs to balance different things? And what we're finding is that net zero is feasible, and that it, you know, that there's not, and this is not necessarily surprising, but there's not just one approach to it, and that it is really going to require us throwing every policy tool, every advancement in technology, and everything we have at this problem, and really addressing climate change as the sort of cultural, societal, and economic shift that it's going to require, and doing that work not in 2030 or 2040, but and certainly this is no surprise to anywhere here, but turning those levers and making sure we're getting on those pathways right now. And so this decade, I think, is particularly critical in terms of where we're going and setting the course. And I think, you know, anyone who thinks about energy systems knows that some of these things need to be really, you know, if you're going to replace a car, you have to think about the lifespan of these things. You know, if someone's going to make a decision on a car between now and 2050, they might change their vehicles 2 or 3 times at most. And so if you're going to steer them to an electric vehicle, you have to work on that every day starting now, because you have a limited number of times that people are going to come in for a new car. And so really thinking about the adoption of some of these new technologies, whether it's in the building sector with heat pumps and other strategies, or if it's in transportation, you have a limited number of hits. And so really focusing in on policies to steer people and drive people to new green technologies is really a critical element of this.
You know, we're living through this unprecedented cultural, social, and economic shift right now. Is COVID-19 changing the modeling?
So the good news is not so much over the long term with what we're thinking. I mean, we're certainly seeing right now some both positive trends and some concerning trends. You know, obviously we've seen a real drop off in traffic. Do we think that's going to last? No, you know, probably not. Not worth modeling this blip out to 2050 in terms of transportation. At the same time, we're also seeing people really not use the T and public transit, which is also something that we think will return, and it would be a very negative trend in terms of 2050. We need people to use public transit. Certainly we need to think about how to make it safe during a pandemic, but the trends that we are seeing now are not things we think are necessarily going to affect 2050 goals or the pathways to get there. we do, one of the things that we've seen that has been disappointing, I would say, in this period is we worked really hard to get new funding for our More EV electric vehicle rebate program. No one is buying electric vehicles right now. I don't think that's a long-term trend either, but it is something we sort of have a couple of pieces where we need to do a lot of work coming out of the pandemic to get some of these programs moving again. And that's one we're particularly interested in focusing on. And I will say, having a plug-in hybrid myself, it's been really nice to just plug it in the garage and not have to go to a gas station for it. So should be a selling point coming out of a pandemic, among all the other benefits.
Well, next question is also about transportation. You mentioned the acronym TCI, but for those listeners on the phone, can you briefly explain what the Transportation Climate Initiative is? And then I've got a follow-up question.
Great. So the Transportation Climate Initiative is an effort that has been led by 12 states in the Northeast and the Georgetown Climate Center to begin the work of reducing transportation sector emissions, particularly from on-road transportation, the cars and trucks I mentioned that are responsible for 84% of transportation sector emissions across the region. And this program would behave very much like the successful Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where there's an emissions limit set on the carbon content of vehicle fuels, and then entities who provide those fuels would have to buy allowances to cover their portion of emissions. States would then get back the proceeds from those auctions and would be able to invest in clean transportation solutions that would help us actually reduce emissions and give people options to use cleaner modes of transportation across the states. Every state would be able to invest the proceeds in ways that were decided by the state and their communities, and in ways that improve public health, reduce emissions, and invest in transportation infrastructure.
Well, at ELM, obviously, we think it's a very elegant policy. We've really appreciated your leadership and Governor Baker's leadership. You guys have been driving forces across the region. For those listening, there was supposed to be the MOU that was supposed to come out this spring. Governors have obviously pushed that back to this fall, given the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about what the appetite is to enter into TCI, given that, on one hand, there's a real need for more revenue, but on the other hand, there may be less appetite to raise prices at the pump?
Yeah, so I think there continues to be really strong coordination among the states. We did push back the deadline to give all of the states time to sort of deal with the pandemic, process what this meant, but none of us feel that this changes the urgency or the need for TCI. And luckily we put ourselves in a good place as states, having done much of the modeling and the work we needed to do, so that a 6-month delay on this does not push us back in terms of when we'd be actually looking for the program to start. Mm-hmm. So none of that has been detracted from, but I think some of the things I mentioned earlier, the connection between local air pollution and public health, and between local air pollution and the pandemic, continues to make a really compelling case for something that's not just dealing with climate change and emissions, but dealing with local air pollution, which is a real environmental justice issue in communities that have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic, I think across the region, not just in Massachusetts. I think builds an even stronger case for TCI, and then the investments that we can make with the revenue in a time when revenues might be limited, and investments in real things like infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, in green technology, in electric vehicles, ties in, I think, very well with a lot of the thinking states have about economic recovery and stimulus. And so I think if anything, I feel an increasing urgency to get this done.
Great. Well, I think ELM and certainly many on the line are here to support you in that. That's great to hear. I want to ask you another question about money. For years, ELM has led the Green Budget Coalition of many environmental organizations across the state to ensure that state agencies, these are your environmental agencies, are equipped with the talent and resources that they need. As you know, the mandates for your agencies seem to get larger by the day. The state budget is facing the steepest declines it's seen since the Great Depression. I mean, it is really bleak. And you and I both know that historically in these downturns, state environmental agencies are sometimes seen as less essential than other line items. They typically suffer disproportionate cuts. Our state agencies, those in your portfolio, are only just recovering from the 2008 recession. And from where a lot of environmental advocates sit, we need these agencies more than ever. I mean, Trump has suspended all EPA enforcement, shoveling more work onto our state Department of Environmental Protection. Our parks are seeing 200% increases in use. And of course, we're still in a climate crisis. And how do these agencies prepare for these budget cuts? And is there criteria for what gets cut, or how do you anticipate managing this massive shortfall?
So I think, as you know, we're certainly heading into an uncertain future when it comes to the state budget. I've been very thankful to the leadership from the lieutenant governor, and the speaker and Senate President Spilka, as they've worked collaboratively during this time on navigating this challenge. We've also been in strong communication with both chairs of Ways and Means, Senator Rodericks and Representative Michaelwitz, to ensure we approach this expected budget deficit together from a whole Commonwealth perspective. I think the biggest unknown that continues to cause uncertainty as we go into the new fiscal year is the assistance there will be from the federal government. And that's really a key piece that we are looking to and having conversations with our federal partners on. But I think it's been very clear, and I think you spoke to this, that over the last 3 months within EEA's agencies, DCR and DEP have, and all of them have stepped up and have been there for the residents of the Commonwealth throughout the various stages of the pandemic. And they've really shown what these agencies are capable of when they have the proper tools, and how they can do their work efficiently and effectively. And I think it's clear how much they're valued by our constituents across the state, and also, as I mentioned, how much folks across the state appreciate the environmental resources we have and the opportunity to get outside. And so I think there's widespread recognition, certainly across the Baker-Polito administration, and I think with our elected representatives as well, that these resources and these agencies are critical. And we really look forward to working as an administration and with all our legislative leaders to produce a budget that balances all of the demands the state will face in the coming months as we continue to move through the pandemic and the recovery. And I think the important dialogue that we need to have with our federal delegation and with groups like ELM who can continue to raise that message to your partners and parent organizations at the federal level is critical as well. I think a key piece of any economic stimulus going forward really needs to include in it a roadmap for a green recovery, significant funding for those type of investments, and then a lot of flexibility for states and how they are making those types of investments. So, we haven't gotten further into the budget discussion really at this point in terms of specific tactics, but we are thinking about this across the different branches in a very holistic way.
Well, that's good to hear. The next two questions do relate to recovery and getting people back to work in ways that accelerate progress towards our climate mitigation and climate resiliency goals. The first relates to offshore wind, of course, an issue dear to my heart, but responsibly developed offshore wind has the potential to employ tens of thousands of people in the Commonwealth. How does the Baker administration intend to harness this potential in our recovery?
So, and thank you for your leadership on offshore wind. It's been terrific, and offshore wind is a key component, as you can imagine, of our pathways to 2050. We continue to be a leader in offshore wind in the US, and our Vineyard Wind project, which many folks have heard about, is the most mature large offshore wind project in the nation, with their draft supplemental environmental impact statement released last week. Much expectation around that being released, and it was released on schedule with this updated timeline. And I think one of the interesting things there is the environmental impact statement actually looked at the whole potential build out of 22 gigawatts of offshore wind that is currently envisioned off of the eastern seaboard. As you know, we also have the Mayflower Wind Project, which is currently in front of the Department of Public Utilities for approval, which puts Massachusetts under contract for 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, which is in a similar position to where New York is in terms of 1,800 megawatts. We have an overall 3,200 megawatt goal right now, and this represents 26% of our load, which is actually the same amount of the 9,000 megawatt goal for New York. That's 26% of their load as well. So in terms of meeting our energy demand through offshore wind, we are on par from a basis of what proportion we are currently setting a target for with the leaders in this field in terms of total absolute megawatts. But I think one of the things that was really important and was a driving force behind the governor's 2016 energy diversity legislation was that being the first mover in this offshore wind procurement space has allowed us to not only start to establish some of the industry here in Massachusetts, but to address many of the barriers to development in a proactive fashion that I think has been sort of a hallmark of how Massachusetts works on energy and environmental issues together through our secretariat. We're one of the few states that has energy and environment sit in one shop with the agencies working together on this. And I think that's been certainly a benefit for our work on clean energy, including offshore wind. Another piece of this has been trying to ensure that our economic development goals are part of that, part of the wind procurements we're doing. And so as we move forward with additional procurements, we'll be moving before there is any planned wind in operation, but we are trying to balance the speed of development with the care and consideration of addressing some of the environmental challenges that offshore wind can create in terms of, particularly in our waters, in terms of fisheries. And that's been some of the caution that the feds have raised. And so we are sensitive to the need for sort of balanced portfolios in terms of siting the resource, getting it deployed, and then making sure we're balancing the fisheries needs with a great need and opportunity for clean energy and offshore development. But I think it's never been more important to get these projects going and to get through the federal permitting process so we can start building them and making them part of the economic recovery. And I had the opportunity, I guess it was last fall now, everything before April seems like it was centuries ago, but to visit the Mass Maritime Academy, where they have the first real training center for offshore wind technicians and folks working on the turbines. And it's just amazing to think about the young people who will get to work in this field going forward and climbing turbines. They have a station where you sort of practice jumping from a boat, from a vessel onto the turbine ladder. And I just think the opportunities here are endless and offer sort of a new energy renaissance for the Northeast. So I'm excited, and I think there's a lot more to do and a lot more ambition to discuss and to talk about, particularly as we look out to 2050.
Great, I couldn't agree more. My last question builds on this idea of recovery before heading over to the audience Q&A. You know, many of us know you by your Twitter handle, Climate Katie, and I think that was before you had your official EEA Twitter handle. But you know, we've closely followed your work establishing the state's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or the MVP program. And for those listening, more than 75%, right, of the Commonwealth cities and towns.
More than 82%.
82% of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts have taken these steps to map their key climate vulnerabilities. And my understanding is that most cities and towns cite funding as the key barrier for implementing these projects. So here we have thousands, tens of thousands of shovel-ready climate resiliency projects scattered across the Commonwealth. At a moment when we need to be reemploying, we have the opportunity to reemploy many, many people. How are you thinking about this incredible trove of resiliency projects in the context of getting the Commonwealth back to work?
Yeah, terrific question. And I think, you know, the way we started this program, it had a $500,000 authorization for basically a small grant program to help cities and towns deal with climate change. And since 2017, the governor has committed over $32 million to the program. So it grew, you know, it doubled in the first year, and then it just exponentially increased given the planning work the communities were doing, given the ability of the program to pull communities into it, and then the need that we saw across the state for these types of projects. And so, you know, while we've committed this much money to it so far, only a fraction of the projects that need to get done are starting to get done. And so there's a real need for more funding, and also, as you mentioned, a real opportunity to make this part of any economic recovery from the pandemic. And so this was certainly one of the ideas we put forward, and that we're talking about with folks on a national level around any infrastructure that comes out of Congress. Any type of economic stimulus package should include a real look at the investments that can be made in aging infrastructure in our communities to adapt and to build resiliency to the climate changes ahead. And certainly at a minimum, we shouldn't be doing infrastructure projects and be planning for historical conditions, because no one's seeing historical conditions anymore. And so one of my real hopes is that, and something we're working on, is that any funding that does come forward would include considerations for climate change in it, so that we're not building ourselves basically into danger zones. But in terms of MVP specifically, I think, you know, something that came to us from our Mass Emergency Management Agency's work with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is that often after a disaster, and, you know, typically FEMA sees more natural disasters, but often after a disaster, there's funding available for proactive projects that will help address the next disaster. But there's not necessarily a pipeline of projects in place to take up that funding when it's available. And so often states actually lose out on available funding because they don't have things in the pipeline that are sort of shovel ready. And the great thing about MVP is it has produced this whole pipeline of shovel-ready projects that we often fund the engineering and feasibility studies for, that are ready to deploy on the ground as funding becomes available. And so there's a real opportunity here for federal funding to play a role, but I think at the state level, even more important to us, and something we've been pushing on over the last year, is our Resilient Massachusetts legislation, or Senate Bill 10, which Governor Baker filed in the beginning of 2019, that would create a stable recurring source of revenue, 137 million annually, $1 billion over 10 years to invest specifically in municipally led resiliency projects, whether it's removing dams that are failing, enhancing nature-based solutions like living shorelines and coastal wetlands to buffer from climate change impacts, or building backup, things as simple as backup generators that are green instead of diesel fired. These are all things that could be contemplated under a program with this type of funding. But at the moment, this was reported out of the Senate and sent to study by the House. And so we're looking for other ways to get this legislation passed. But I think the key here is that we need funding, that these are real opportunities and jobs for engineers, for the construction industry, and for planners everywhere across the state, and that this type of funding would help communities not just address the risk, but really build and design the communities that they want to see over the next 100 years.
Great. So there's no clear funding path right now.
Not right now. We are certainly committed to continue to funding the program through our capital plan. And it's in there going forward. I think the capital plan is being released shortly and will include funding for MVP, but we really need a dedicated new source of revenue for this program.
All right, well, I'm gonna switch gears because we've got lots of questions here. A bunch of questions about both the Weymouth compressor station and environmental justice. And so I'm going to try to do our viewers, hopefully not the disservice of bundling them into one question. The compressor station is one that's come up in a few of these sessions actually, and it's been in the news again recently, the first district court ruling. And one viewer writes in that decision, quote, "The court dismissed the environmental justice portion of the complaint on the grounds that Massachusetts environmental justice law is not strong enough to prevent a compressor in an already overburdened community. Unlike Virginia, where an EJ law recently stopped a similar project. In light of this, and given the intersection of the climate crisis and the pandemic on racial justice and COVID-19, what is the administration's perspective on meaningful environmental justice provisions that the legislature could pass this session?" And you mentioned EEA's new EJ director. Is this among their top 2 or 3 priorities?
So I think at EEA, there has been a long-term commitment to environmental justice, but there's certainly room to build on this legacy. This dates back to a 2002 environmental justice policy that was among the first of such state policies in the US and was actually used as a model and was drafted with very robust stakeholder involvement. That, really was not updated until 2017 when EEA put out an environmental justice policy built on this foundation with also a secondary screening process that looks at both existing health burdens and vulnerabilities in terms of vulnerable health environmental justice population. This policy and the process under it takes into account the Department of Public Health data for a community regarding a number of different factors, including emergency department visits, elevated childhood lead levels, low birth rates, and other factors. But later this year, we will be undertaking an additional process, building on this work in 2017, to again review and revise the policy to address current concerns. I think we're looking at COVID status as becoming part of this vulnerable health environmental justice assessment. I think we're working towards a definition of environmental justice populations that brings greater focus to this intersection between environmental protection and public health. We've certainly seen that starkly during this time. And then as part of this revision and update, we will assess how we can take into account the effects of cumulative impacts and background conditions in our decision-making across EEA agencies. And this is certainly something that we've heard more about recently, the ability to look at sort of the cumulative impact piece of the burdens that may be placed on communities. But I think one of the great things about our environmental justice director's role is that it's not just working across our secretariat, it's working across our secretariat, but also across the administration, much in the way that we've done with climate change. And I think that's important because it's not making a separate effort. It's saying that environmental justice, similarly to climate change, needs to be incorporated into the work we do day to day, into the decisions we make day to day, and into the pieces of environmental policy, but policy even more broadly. So the director's focus right now is implementing our executive order 552, working on a governor's advisory council on environmental justice, which is a full administration-wide effort, and then a cross-cabinet environmental justice working group. And so that will be leading to an end of the year revamp and update of the EJ policy with a real view on addressing current concerns that have been brought into sharp focus through these recent events. I think some of the key features of the review will include a look at how we define an environmental justice population, how we may assess cumulative impacts in decision making. It's not currently something that many states look at, and it's something that we want to take a thorough look at and incorporate. And then a review of other areas of crucial intersection, such as thresholds under our Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act, the Net Zero 2050 roadmap, and then expanding concerns in terms of climate justice. To Weymouth specifically, Massachusetts has a fairly limited role in terms of the permitting process for Weymouth, and the issue that has come up was the air permit that was issued last summer by the Department of Environmental Protection. And so that has been remanded and vacated and sent back to DEP. And so on Friday, Commissioner Suberg directed the agency to do the additional analysis that was required by the First Circuit Court. And so that process has begun.
Good to hear. Building on the conversation about recovery, a popular question here about the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Clean energy jobs accounted for over 3% of the Massachusetts economy before COVID, due in no small part to the efforts of Mass CEC. It is facing an existential funding question here at this moment when arguably we need it more than ever. How can we ensure it has the funding it needs to fuel the green recovery we want?
Great question, and certainly green jobs are a key part of the recovery, and we have seen some of the challenges across different sectors, particularly on the mass save side, where contractors have not been working, energy efficiency contractors have not been working during the pandemic because of the need to go into people's homes in a less optimal, less socially distant manner. And so we're working to help, particularly the energy efficiency side, get going again. But in terms of the Clean Energy Center, absolutely essential going forward, and have been so important over the last 10 years at creating this clean energy ecosystem. Before the pandemic, we were working with a group of consultants and with the board of directors and leadership at CEC EEA and DOER to really think about what the next 10 years of the Clean Energy Center looks like and what the focus would be, knowing that some of what they set out to achieve has been set up in a good way. And so what are the next challenges we want to take on? And so we're really looking to the building sector, which is a sector we need to make a lot of progress on in terms of emission reductions, the transportation sector, wind, and continuing the push for offshore wind and policy and technology advancements that need to accompany that, and then a clean grid going forward. But there is certainly, as you mentioned, a very clear need to think about the next steps for the budget and funding. And so we, I think recognize that a collaborative effort with stakeholders to figure out what that new budget should look like, where it should come from, and how we make it sustainable, and also how we make sure that the different parts of the clean energy, I guess I'll call it ecosystem here for lack of a better word, are working together most effectively, whether it's, DOER's role in sort of deploying policy, CEC's role in being more the leading edge, and then groups like Greentown Labs, who do so much for startups and small businesses and incubate these groups here in Massachusetts, and now is expanding to Texas. And so I think I look forward to continued conversations on how we can ensure CEC is going into the next decade in a really healthy place.
Good. I'd like to squeeze in a quick waste question and then a closing question here in our just last couple of minutes. So really briefly on waste. Mm-hmm. The Baker administration, because of public health concerns, has rolled back some policies designed to reduce waste, plastic bag bans, bottle deposits, and so on. And at the same time, DEP is updating the solid waste master plan and trying to build a very different culture around trash reduction and material reuse. What's going to be the administration's policy on reuse going forward?
So we are very, and working on this very hard before and during the pandemic, our solid waste master plan that is due, that outlines basically how we get to 2030 goals for solid waste. We have pushed back the timeline a bit to ensure a robust stakeholder process and to ensure that some of the lessons we've been learning through the pandemic are included. You mentioned the bottles and the exemption they had during the pandemic. That's been rolled back. Redeemables now do need to go to redemption centers, and those are reopened for the most part. There was a lot of fear early on that might be a vector for COVID germs spreading. There hasn't been a lot of evidence to that end, but we have been very careful here that anything we put on pause during the pandemic would be returned in a responsible way as soon as it was safe to do so. And so the next thing on our list is certainly the bag ban, and that's not really one we have any kind of regulatory role in, since it's a local issue. It's a guidance that the Department of Public Health put out, but we are, looking to that and helping them to prepare for removing that guidance and allowing bags, allowing cloth bags back at markets and grocery stores going forward. We have a real need to, and this is sort of the line our waste plan is going down. We have a real need to increase composting, getting organics out of the waste stream, and that's something that we will speak a lot to in the solid waste master plan. There's a lot of opportunity, whether it's anaerobic digestion or other vehicles for compost.
We're coming, Secretary, we're coming to the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of your time and of everyone's time. So I want to close by thanking you for this conversation and invite you to give one last remark here. I want to thank our friends at Biogen for making this series possible, and remind folks to look out for an email from the ELM team with a recording of this session and links to the prior sessions. Secretary, we really look forward to continuing to elevate these issues in the months and years ahead. And so to send us out, can you respond to a question that is also quite popular in the chat here about a green and economic recovery? What opportunities do you see coming out of this crisis, and what can listeners do to help?
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, and your team for putting together this series and keeping the conversation around these issues going through a time when we've all needed to be apart. I am really looking forward to continuing our work together and to helping people think about what a recovery that is green and climate friendly and racially just and inclusive could look like, not just on a larger scale, which sometimes is the way we think about environmental policy, but also at the community scale and at the public health scale, and to think about the ties between how basically taking care of our home relates to our own health and to our ability to continue to live on this planet in a way that's healthy. But I think in terms of economic stimulus, in terms of the priorities we need to make as a state, using the moment to really keep the focus on how we address climate change going forward, how we use it as a guidepost to the investments that we may be making under any economic stimulus. Those should be in clean, green infrastructure. They should be in things that support a transition away from fossil fuels towards clean transportation, towards clean electricity, and towards a clean building sector. They should be in things that support community resilience, whether that's in infrastructure or in the social fabric that communities need to put in place. And there should, I think the moment that we saw for people to appreciate the natural world needs to be reflected going forward. Our land and the work we've done on land conservation is something that people don't think about as much as maybe we need to. And so, I would love something like a youth conservation corps, or a way to get people working in our parks out of any kind of economic recovery we see. And we know the National Wildlife Federation, for example, and other groups are talking about this, but we've seen just how important these parks, local parks, state parks, and certainly our national parks across the country are. They're an undervalued and critical piece of our infrastructure and need our continued support and funding. Your voices are so important, and your ideas are so important. And I think continued public emphasis on climate change, on environmental justice, and on conservation is what makes a difference here.
Thank you. Well, Secretary, we could talk all day, but I really, really appreciate your time. It means a lot, and I'm wishing you and your family well. Thanks to everyone who's listened in. Take care.